Thanks, Dave, and thank you all for coming here today and giving us this opportunity to share with you some of our recent work on corrections realignment. Before I get started, I also want to point out that this is joint work with Catherine Kramer, who's here today as well. She's a former colleague at PPIC who's now pursuing her PhD in economics at UC Davis. So she'll be helping me out with the Q&A section of this talk today. So. Let me start by giving you a preview of some of the key findings of this brief report here. And I think it's uniformly understood that that corrections realignment presented itself as a pretty serious challenge to the counties. And that includes the sheriffs and the jails. And what we're doing in this piece, we're going to look at the jails, not just after realignment, but also before. And what becomes clear when you take a look at this is that jails were really already facing some serious capacity constraints before realignment began. When we look at the prison population, what we find is that the decline in the prison population that was pretty rapid and dramatic in the first few months of realignment, that decline is not matched by an increase in the jail population. We find that in the first 3 months, and that's something to keep in mind here, is that when we're talking about those, the post-realignment period, it's restricted to the first 3 months of realignment. So it's a bit of a caveat there. But what we find there is that for every 3 felons who are no longer sent to our state prisons, the jail population increased by 1 inmate. So not a 1-to-1 correspondence between those populations. As I mentioned, the jails were facing as well capacity constraints prior to realignment, and the initial response to these challengers in the face of these capacity constraints appears to have been a reduction particularly in the unsentenced inmate population. So those are kind of the key findings here, and I'm going to be spending some time now providing some context of those and some background and explain how we came to those particular findings. So here's an outline of what I'll be doing here now for the next 25, 30 minutes or so. I'm going to start by a pretty brief background of realignment, describe what it's doing, and a little bit of explanation of why we implemented realignment. Then I'm going to move on to the initial post-realignment observations. So again, we're going to have some observations of what happened in those first few months of realignment. But then we're going to take a step back and see what the jail situation was before realignment. And I'll give you some reason for why we think that's well worth it in addressing the kinds of questions that we want to do here. And then we're going to be looking at the capacities of the jails in California, as well as the constraints that were faced. And then we'll end up with a conclusion. So, like I said, I don't think there's really any controversy by stating that corrections realignments really present some new challenges to counties, and including county jails. What realignment did, so here are kind of like 3 of the main features of realignment. Now, lower-level felons, so these are non-serious, non-sexual, non-violent felons who in the past would have been sent to our state prisons, are now going to go to county jail. Okay? Another important feature, particularly with respect to the jail situation, is that technical parole violators are no longer sent back to state prisons. So that's not an option available to the counties for technical parole violation, for example. And then lastly, an important new feature of the legislation is that counties now are going to supervise low-level offenders who are released from the state prisons, and these are the PRCS population, the post-release community supervision population. So these I think, are the 3 most important features of realignment. Realignment was a bit unique in that the process and the implementation was very quick. It was proposed in January of 2011. It was mainly passed by the spring of the same year. Funding arrangements were in place by the summer. And then in October, it was implemented. So a very short period of time for something as major as this reform. It also was implemented very quickly. So the prison population is going to be a key, and I'll talk in just a few seconds about what really was motivating realignment, but the overcrowding in the prison was the main thing. And what we see is that the prison population decreased very rapidly. In just the first 3 months of realignment, we saw a drop in the prison population of about 12,800. So not all of that is due to realignment, and we'll talk about that, but we certainly see a very, very rapid decline in the prison population. So again, coming back to why realignment happened, and then also a little bit about the way that it was designed. So really what motivated realignment was the prison overcrowding situation here in California. It not surprisingly brought some lawsuits and legal challenges, and most relevant to realignment was the federal three-judge panel mandate that told the state it had to reduce its prison population to 137.5% of its design capacity, a major reduction in the prison population. The state challenged this, but it was upheld in the Supreme Court in May of 2011. Just to give you an idea of what it means to bring down the population to 137.5%. So when realignment was implemented October 1st, it meant that we needed to bring it down by about 30,000 prisoners, so pretty substantial. There were other couple of contributing factors to realignment, taking this kind of shape. One was that we were spending a lot of money on our prison system. It was increasing, and as we all know, these are pretty fiscally tight times, so spending our way out of that situation by expanding prison capacity was not really feasible. But importantly, it was also believed that counties were actually better at handling this population of lower risk felons. So that, I think, is an important part of the way that realignment was designed. So let's take a look at what happened in the first few months. And in fact, this figure that I'm showing here, which is the weekly prison population, actually goes beyond the first 3 months. This is really the only piece of data that we have in that I'll be showing you here, and this graph is actually not in the report, that extends beyond 2011. And what you see here is that the prison population, this starts January 1st in 2011, it was relatively stable. It was actually declining somewhat, but not majorly. But when realignment was implemented on October 1st of 2011, represented by that vertical bar that you see there, we see a pretty rapid decline in the prison population. And as I said, just in that first 3 months, it was a reduction of 12,800. Most of that reduction that took place in the first 4 or 5 months. That was the most rapid decline, and it has stabilized since. And we're down to about a reduction in the total prison population of about 26,000 or so now. But it's, as you can see, that's kind of flattened out at this point. So we don't really expect it to decrease very dramatically in the near future unless some other changes take place. So a pretty dramatic decrease in the prison population. If we then compare that to what happened in our county jail population by looking at the average daily population in our county jails, we see that that was actually decreasing, had been decreasing for a number of years. It was, varying. These are monthly figures that I'm showing you here. But then in the later months of 2011, we start to see an increase in the jail population, which is to be expected if you keep in mind what realignment is doing, that it's sending a lot of these offenders down to the counties, and some of them are intended to be incarcerated. And of course, part of what realignment wanted to do as well, or the intention behind it, was to also seek alternative sanctions instead of solely relying on incarceration. So we see that the jail population is increasing, but it's worthwhile to kind of break down the average daily population into two populations, and that is the sentenced population and the non-sentenced or the unsentenced population. Non-sentenced population is the majority of jail inmates in California, and that includes a very important group, and these are inmates who are awaiting trial, so the pretrial population is included in there. The pretrial population had actually been increasing as a share of the total jail population for a number of years. But when realignment happened, that population decreased quite dramatically. Okay, so before realignment, the non or the unsentenced population represented about 71% statewide of our jail population, and just in the few months since realignment was implemented, it dropped down to about 65%. But you see, trends are quite different for the sentenced and the unsentenced population. So while we see that decrease in the unsentenced population, we see a sharp increase that takes place right around the time of realignment. So it's important that we distinguish between these populations. There's a lot to be learned by doing that as well. So what we want to do is we want to move and we want to see what is the relationship between the changes in the prison population and the changes in the jail population. So the way we're going to do this is we're going to take a look at that last quarter of 2011. That is our post-realignment period. And we're going to see what happened to the prison population in that last quarter of 2011. So that is the first 3 months of realignment that we see. So that is the Q4 2011 column that we see here. And we see that drop that I've mentioned a couple of times now of about 12,800 prisoners. But that's probably not a good approximation estimate of what the impact of realignment is, because there are other factors at play here. There's seasonality, there are trends as well, and I mentioned that the prison population was decreasing somewhat prior to that. So in order to account for that, we go back to 2010 and we take a look at that same period, the last quarter, and see what the changes were over that period. And what we see is that the prison population was actually decreasing by about 1,700. So our approximation of what realignment did to the prison population is then the difference between these two. And that comes to about 11,100. So that's the decline in the prison population that we think is a pretty good estimate or approximation of what realignment did to the prison population. Now we want to move on and compare that to what happened then in our county jails. So we do the same kind of calculations. We'll look at that last quarter of 2011. And what we see there is, well, it really didn't increase that much. 359 inmates is the entire increase that we see in those in that last quarter. But it's important to keep in mind that graph that I showed you before, where we saw a pretty rapid decrease in the jail population. Okay? So if then we can think of that last quarter of 2010 as really representing what kind of would have happened in 2011 if realignment didn't take place. Again, the difference between those two numbers should give us a pretty good approximation of what realignment did to the county population. And here we see that it increased by about 4,000. Okay? So what it tells us is that we certainly don't have a one-to-one match between the decrease in the prison population and the jail population. So the jail population increases by about 1 inmate for every 3 felons no longer in prison. So that's an important finding, I think. But it's also, we want to keep in mind the graph that I showed you with the different trends in the sentenced and the unsentenced population. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to break down that total average daily population and see what the changes were in the average daily populations who were unsentenced and sentenced. Do the same kind of calculations. And what we see there is that for the sentenced average daily population, we estimate that it increased by about 7,300 due to realignment. So that's our approximate, what we think is the approximate change due to realignment to the sentenced jail population. The unsentenced population is quite different. It has to be, actually, if I just said that the impact on the overall population was an increase in 4,000. For that to happen, it must have been the case that the unsentenced population decreased. And that's indeed what we find. Same calculations, we see that decreased by about 3,300. Okay? So, well worthwhile taking a little closer look at those numbers to see kind of what they mean. And so if we start with that sentenced population, so our estimate is then that the jail population, the sentenced jail population, increased by about 7,300 inmates. Well, that's pretty close to what was reported in July of this year by CPOC that had actually collected information on the newly sentenced realignment population, the so-called 1170H offenders. And they report that it was around 7,000, close to 7,200. So our estimate of what the impact on the sentenced population of 7,300 was is really quite close to that. And that's really not too surprising. You'd expect, these guys are sentenced to spending time being incarcerated in jail. We see that in the data as well. So that closely matches. But one important population that drove down the prison population that is not included in the 1170H population are parole violators. Technical parole violators who in the past would have gone to prison, they don't anymore. So they will be at the responsibility of the county. So the question then is that should have put upward pressure on the jail population. And the question is, where could we capture that? Well, we think that these technical parole violators are most likely to be counted, of course, among the unsentenced population. But this is a population that we saw a decline of 3,300. So it suggests that, to some extent, that these violators might actually be spending less time, if any time, behind bars. But it is another population as well that would contribute to this, and that would be, of course, that it was a decrease in the pretrial population as well. So there's some combination of those two changes that are taking place that gives us then a decline in the unsentenced population of about 3,300. All right, so let's take a look at the county jails and what the situation was before realignment. So we think this is important. It's going to not only provide some context for the challenges that are ahead for our county jails, but it might also help us understand better the kinds of numbers that I just presented and better then have an idea of what are the driving forces behind those numbers. So we're going to look at three key areas. We're going to look at the incarcerated population and the incarceration rates in the state and also how it varies across the counties. We're going to quickly look at the composition as well. And then importantly, we're going to take a look at the capacity and put the numbers who are incarcerated and compare them to the capacity to have an idea of what the capacity constraints are. So remember, now what I'm going to be presenting are data before realignment. So the data here are from October 2010 through September 2011. And if we start by looking at the total population, statewide in that year, prior to realignment, the average daily population, which is an average monthly population, was around 71,000. And not surprisingly, most of these inmates are housed in some of our largest counties. So for example, LA, Orange County, San Bernardino. More than 1/3 of the total jail population housed in the state of California are in these counties. And not surprisingly, the smallest jail populations are found in the smallest counties. But it's also true that the incarceration rate, measured as the number of folks who are incarcerated in our jails divided by 100,000 residents, so it's the average daily population per 100,000 residents, it varied quite dramatically across the different counties. Statewide average was 159, but then you had some counties that had very high incarceration rates, small counties, so these are sensitive to just some minor changes in the inmate populations. We want to keep that in mind. But we see some, and we see Yuba standing out as well as a very high rate. But it's important to keep in mind with Yuba, when we take a closer look at that, we realize that they house a substantial number of inmates who are on federal contracts. In fact, 54% of Yuba's jail population in the year before realignment were inmates on federal contracts. So you might wonder, well, who are these folks? A large number of these inmates are ICE holds, so immigration holds. So that accounts for why Yuba has such a high incarceration rate. The lowest rates are found in Marin, Shasta, and San Mateo. If we move on to take a look at the composition of this population, we see that most inmates were unsentenced. So that's really the key population. And I think, kind of jumping ahead a little bit, but when we're thinking about jail population management and how we can address some capacity constraints, this is really the population we want to think about. About 71% of the jail population were unsentenced. Again, it's going to vary greatly across counties. Some of the small counties have very low rates of unsentenced or shares of unsentenced. And then you have the highest percentages found in Contra Costa, Fresno, and again, Yuba. But remember, in Yuba, we have the issue of the ICE holds, for example. Felons represent the majority of inmates in our county jails. On statewide, it's around 80%. Again, it varies dramatically. In some small counties, it's quite low. Santa Cruz stands out there as well. I wouldn't categorize it as a particularly small county, but it stands out there as one of the two counties where actually felons are a minority. Even in Tehama, it's slightly above the 50% mark. Yolo, Fresno, and San Francisco have very high rates, shares of felons in their jail population, and they are around 95% in these counties on average. All right, so let's take these numbers. Now we have an idea of what the numbers are, who's in jail. Now let's compare that to the capacities of jails to get an idea of if there are any capacity constraints. And of course, we, as I started off saying, that there are indeed some capacity constraints. So let's shed some light on that. The rated jail capacity prior to realignment of all the jails in this category in the state of California was close to 76,000. And then remember that I said the average daily population was about 71,000. So when we look at this, it looks like, well, we're in pretty good shape then, right? Well, it's something that varies, for one thing, across counties. And there are a number of counties that face some serious capacity constraints. And one indication of this is the fact that 17 counties were operating under some kind of court order that limited the number of inmates that they could hold. And that includes some very large counties, some of the largest counties in the state, like LA and San Diego, and as well as Riverside, San Bernardino, Sacramento, Fresno, and Kern. So that tells us that they were facing some issues and constraints there. Many of these, if we then take these average daily population and compare it to those rated capacities, we see that a number of these were operating pretty close to or above capacity level. Statewide, it's about 93%. In some of the small counties, these are not particularly close to any capacity constraints, but again, remember, these are small counties. But there are a number of counties that are operating at above or, at least at their capacity level. The ones with the highest such numbers are Orange, Monterey, and Imperial. In total, there were 13 counties that had their average daily population greater to their rated capacity. So that suggests that there were a number of counties that really were facing some constraints there. But again, that really doesn't give us a good depiction of what those capacity constraints really were. These are averages, right? So in some days, the inmate population is going to be greater, and in some days it's going to be lower. And it's going to vary daily and seasonally as well. So we probably don't want to say that that's really the best measure of what the kinds of capacity constraints we're facing. So instead, if we take a look at the peak demand, looking at what the highest number of inmates the counties were housing in any one day during the month, and we compare that to the rated capacity, we go from being below to above, to 102.5% statewide. Now, almost half of the counties in the state of California are operating above their capacity. There are 26 counties that were operating above their capacity if we look at that highest one-day count. But even this measure actually understates kind of what the demand is, because what the sheriffs have to do is they have to assign specific kind of beds depending on the inmate who's coming in. So these will be assigned or defined by gender, for example, by security risks. There are gang issues as well. So for understandable reasons, they would like to have a little wiggle room and a vacancy factor that allows them to actually house inmates in the sections, in the beds that gives them the security and that nothing will happen to them. So again, even looking at the high count, that understates the demand. Another factor that suggests, or quite strongly points towards an understatement of what the demand is the fact that a number of counties actually released inmates due to housing constraints. So on average, each month prior to realignment, there were 6,800 pretrial and 3,900 sentenced inmates who were released due to capacity constraints. So all in all, it really suggests that these our county jails were facing some serious capacity constraints prior to realignment. So the question is, what do we do then? So how can we address these kind of capacity constraints? Well, building more capacity is one solution. State legislature has addressed this. There has been, relatively recent legislation that provides funding. AB 900, that was passed in 2007, created $1.2 billion in state matching funds for county jail expansion. So counties had to kick in, depending on what phase, 10 to 25% of the construction cost. And there have been 18 counties that have received conditional awards so far for an expansion of about 9,200 jail beds. So that's part of it. More recently, I think it was in June of this year, that SB 1020 was passed, and that made an additional $500 million available in matching funds for the counties. But even with the state providing funding, it's important to keep in mind that this is still a very costly option, that running a jail is very expensive. So the construction cost accounts for less than, or roughly about 10% of the total lifetime cost of a jail. So it's a serious fiscal commitment to take to expand these jails. So it's quite clear then that we need to think about other options and thinking about pursuing options that are not going to jeopardize public safety. One is to take a look at the pretrial population. Remember, I said that this is the biggest share of the inmate population in California jails. One possibility is to look at the possibility of releasing pretrial inmates who can't make bail. Possibility would be to use risk assessment to release those offenders who are deemed to possess the least risk of participating in some new criminal activity. And there are also possibility of maintaining some sort of supervision. If it's through check-ins, it could be something like an ankle GPS bracelet, for example. Another option to reduce the pretrial population would be to lower the bail schedule. Okay? So that would also have that impact. If we look at the sentenced population, which is a key population now in the post-realignment period, enforcing alternative sanctions would be something that will be needed to pursue. And that was an intention of realignment as well. So some of the options that could be considered and are being used are day reporting centers. Substance abuse is a big problem. So substance abuse treatment could be something to look at carefully in providing for these offenders, as well as home detention, again, with electronic monitoring. So just some ways to potentially do this. And then there's the possibility of continuing the early release that we have seen already before realignment was relatively heavily used. So that would be another possible way of addressing the capacity constraints. All right. So conclusion. So let me start by just giving you the key findings here, or some of the key findings. See a rapid and substantial decrease in the prison population in the first few months of realignment, about 11,000 due to realignment. We see that the increase in the jail population is substantially smaller than that, only about 4,000. So for every 3 prisoners no longer housed in our state prisons, the jail population increased by 1. So again, we don't see that one-to-one correspondence between the decrease in the prison population and the increase in the jail population. Importantly, looking at what the situation was prior to realignment, it's quite clear that jails face some serious capacity constraints. And these new responsibilities that stem from realignments, they add some pressure to this part of our criminal justice system. Incarceration is a costly option, so we clearly need to look at alternative approaches and do that in as safe of a way as possible. The initial kind of response or approach to this appears to include to have these reductions in the unsentenced population. So it tells us that some offenders are spending less or no time behind bars. We don't know to what extent that's driven by a reduction in the pretrial population or if it's changes to incarceration of parole violators. The data that is currently available is not rich enough to answer that question. And then, of course, these are big changes, so the consequences of these big changes, such a major reform as realignment, it's important to track those, and particularly high on that list would, of course, be public safety.